English translation, 715th Contact Part 2 Saturday, the 23rd of February 2019, 21:51 hours.
But look here. Michael has written this as you requested, precisely because of what the sectarian swinging waves of the delusional earthlings are doing. This also applies to my computer, which is influenced by these swinging waves and, having become independent, is constantly working actively against what is truthfully written by me against the delusion of God, as well as in the way that special texts which point to the danger of religious delusion and its degenerations in the whole world are simply deleted from me in their entirety. You and also some core group members have experienced yourself what strange things and occurrences happen in my workroom, as it was also the case when I let Michael read 2 pages from the last conversation report on the computer. It was something that Zaphanat Paneak had explained, and that was not exactly friendly to religion and delusion, which is why it was made to disappear again, as has become customary since the independently activated sectarian swinging waves and their impulses keep maliciously deleting everything that is directed against the religious delusion of the earthlings, so that I have to write everything again or twice or even 3 times.
Short report on an incident in Billy's office.
A few days ago, I was sitting in Billy's office late in the evening, and we were talking about the possible nature of that energy which triggers extremely strange incidents in his office and at the computer. In this context, Billy was kind enough to open a contact report in his computer and asked me to read Zaphanat Paneak's explanation regarding this energy. It was a longer answer, so Billy offered me a chair, and I sat down next to him and read the 2-page answer in his computer. Billy highlighted the text in blue so I could read it better, as I had to read with his glasses because I did not have mine with me. The answer was so long that Billy had to scroll up the text 2 or 3 times with his mouse. When he pushed the text up the last time, I could still see the end of the answer on the last half page, and there were only a few sentences left to read. Billy let go of the mouse and pulled his hand back, but no sooner had he leaned back in his chair and pulled his hand about 30 centimeters away from the mouse than I saw, because I was looking at the monitor during the whole process, that before my eyes in the computer, within a split second and for no apparent reason, the entire 2-page text suddenly disappeared. Dumbfounded, I looked at the monitor and waited a moment, expecting the text to reappear, but it did not. After a few seconds, I drew Billy's attention to the fact that he turned back to the computer and searched for the text, which had disappeared altogether and could no longer be found. Not only had the highlighted text completely disappeared, but the entire file was gone. Billy had only let go of the mouse, not pressed any key, and withdrawn his hand, nothing more. According to my observation and attention, Billy had done nothing that could explain a disappearance of the file. The computer had not crashed, but continued to run and was fully functional. So that I could read the end of Zaphanat Paneak's reply after all, Billy opened the remaining backup copy, which then, after I left the office, also disappeared without a trace. The 23rd of February, 2019, Michael V. Hinter Shmadruti 1225, 8495 Shmadruti.
The sonar are endeavoring with their research to counteract or neutralize these sectarian swinging waves. Their energies and impulses, which have become independent and are very actively directed against you. But unfortunately, this will take a lot of time. This, of course, is not helping you now, and unfortunately, the whole of these sectarian vibrational impulse attacks against you and your work in terms of malicious interference and causing damage will continue until the sonar can counter these sectarian energies.
I realize that too. But even though it is unpleasant, I just carry on with my work and try not to get into trouble, because if that were to happen, it might achieve what I think is intended, which is that I would go mad. So, in any case, I think that this could be the purpose of the malicious exercise, but also that I would simply stop my work. But how this is also intended to declare me and the Figu all around in the world, and among the Figu members themselves, as crazy, insane, untrustworthy, and insane. This is precisely because hardly any human being takes all the occurrences in my office and at the computer seriously and as fact, but simply considers them to be crazy fantasies, etc.
The possibilities you mention will certainly all apply, because all the events and occurrences are so unbelievable that hardly any Earth human being will be able to comprehend them if he or she has not experienced and witnessed the phenomena, occurrences, and results. This is also what happened to me when you told me about all the steadily increasing number of strange incidents. Which is why I thought about whether you might have overburdened yourself with your tireless work and thus fallen prey to deceptions and illusions, because I was unable to understand your explanations. In fact, I only came away from my thoughts in this regard when I was able to witness for myself in your presence and experience that these strange occurrences also effectively happened during my presence. And that the cause of this is the religious sectarian energetic swinging waves which have been acting independently for a long time is now also proven by the research and findings of the sonar. But just as I was unable to comprehend your statements about the strange happenings in your workroom and on the computer, it is probably also what happened to all core group members when you told them about it. For some members, it also had to be first that they themselves experienced such occurrences in your workroom, and thus learned that your statements correspond to the effective reality and truth and not to any imaginations and illusions.
Yes, that is at least comforting, whereby I mean it in the sense that it makes it clear that I am neither crazy nor addicted to morbid fantasies, nor am I fibbing or cheating.
In that way, I can understand how it is comforting to you.
Then everything is clear. But now the question in relation to the style, to which I think, however, that this should not then be openly mentioned in the written report of the conversation. Or what do you think about that?
I also think so, because it should not become public, but only be recognizable to the core group itself what it is about. That the core group decision on this was taken in 1981, that can be mentioned. Also that this resolution was only passed orally at that time for certain reasons, but was not statute and also not inserted into the statutes, this can be said today, and as an entry in the statutes now, however, can be made up for. We can therefore discuss this matter again in our conversation today, and thus also the forms.
Of course, but then who is to write this article of the statutes and bylaws?
We already discussed this in 1982 and formulated the following, but it should not be included in the statutes, only in the bylaws.
If I recall our conversation today and write it down, it will be soon enough if I then write this article down separately to bring it up only at the next core group General Assembly, or...
There is no hurry.
Good. But then I would like to briefly address the article of the statutes in terms of what it actually contains, precisely in relation to physical and mental health damage, because I think that this can actually also be said officially if I do not openly mention the actual article in the process. In particular, it is about the mental state, which is mainly addressed, which is why I want to say the following about it. A mental disorder is a condition characterized by pathological changes in experience, and behavior. Such a severe mental disorder is associated with blatant deviations of perception, consequently also with wrong thoughts and the resulting wrong feelings, which leads to a catastrophically wrong self-perception, and to a completely wrong self-image and to absolutely wrong self-judgment. Psychological disorders are typically associated with a clear sense of personal suffering, and also with stresses and problems that occur in various areas of life. One component of such disorders is often a strongly reduced self-regulation competence, as a result of which those affected can only influence their illness with difficulty or not at all, even through increased efforts, self-discipline, or willpower. This is because the psychological symptoms are based on serious problems that make it impossible to cope with everyday life. As a result, Healthy and valuable behavioral patterns are absent, and disturbances and difficulties are caused, whereby social and interpersonal relationships are impaired to the point of stagnation. Mental disorders are illnesses that have extremely varied manifestations, which are very widespread among Earthlings, as I am aware. But if I now omit the actual article of the statutes, and only mention the appendix you mentioned from Art. 11:15 from 1, then that should surely be okay, right?
There is nothing wrong with that if you really only mention the appendix, which is indeed important.
That's what I said. Consequently, I will now therefore retrieve and insert what you have explained at this point, but leave out the actual Article 11:15(1). Statutes Art. 11:15(a). If there is a mental illness, such illness shall be deemed to be the same as a physical illness or physical injury resulting from an accident. B. In any case, a diagnosis of a physical or mental illness, its symptoms and the resulting behavior may only be made by medical professionals and not by FIGU members who are not knowledgeable. It is impossible for lay people to diagnose a mental illness in particular. Moreover, such a diagnosis requires long conversations between the patient and expert doctors or a psychologist, the latter having to be highly qualified. C. It should be noted that if a FIGU member has a mental illness, this must under no circumstances be met with prejudice, as unfortunately happens very often with Earth humans as a result of ignorance and lack of understanding, which makes a person with a mental illness the victim of prejudice, stigmatization, and discrimination. Basically, it must therefore be shown that mental illnesses must be considered in the same way as physical illnesses, accidents, and suffering. 1. Mental illnesses are the following, but not fully listed, manifestations. A. Anxiety disorders equals sign. Anxiety is associated with mental disorders, characteristic or excessive, exaggerated fear reactions, but in the absence of a real external threat. Spontaneous and free-floating, grossly diffuse, unspecific fears that have no situation or object as a trigger, etc. B. Phobias equals sign. These are directed towards concrete things and are bound to certain triggering objects, situations or premises, such as buildings, objects, areas, human beings, lack of space, animals or other living beings, etc., etc. C. Bipolar disorders equals sign. Severe chronic mental illness, manic, depressive mood swings, exaggerated elation, hyperactivity, euphoria or irritability, etc. D. Borderline equals sign. Personality disorder BPD, or emotional instability, typical impulsivity, unstable interpersonal relationships, rapid mood changes, fluctuating self-image due to disturbed self-perception, etc. E. Depression equals sign. Depressive disorders occur over a longer period of time as a severe mental illness. Dejection, lack of interest, exhaustion, listlessness, melancholy, imaginary complaints, reduced appetite and loss of weight, loss of sexual interest, headaches, dizziness, back pain, breathing difficulties, heart problems, gastrointestinal or stomach and intestinal problems, etc. F. Eating disorders equals sign. Eating excessive, insufficient or the wrong food, binge eating disorder, bulimia as addictive bouts of ravenous hunger followed by deliberate vomiting, etc. G. Anorexia equals sign. Anorexia nervosa, eating disorder caused by mental illness and depression, leads to morbid emaciation, highest mortality rate ever, etc. H. Schizophrenia equals sign. Changes in everyday mood disorders, nervousness, restlessness, irritability, lack of concentration, sleep disorders, depressed mood, brooding, neglect of personal appearance, severe psychosis or severe mental disorder, thought disorders, emotional disorders, delusions, hallucinations, split consciousness, living in reality as well as in an imaginary world, etc. I. Addictive disorders equals sign. Pathological substance-related dependence, addictive substance disease, pathological strong urge for addictive substances, psychological addictive disease, etc. J. Factitious syndrome equals sign. Artificial disorder, mental disorder, severe proxy syndrome, luminary killer syndrome, faking physical illness, deliberately causing physical illness, compulsive physical self-harm, inventing fantastic stories of illness, constantly changing doctors, etc. So that would be that, which then brings me to the question of which of my 2 new books should we print now?
We are not clear about that yet, because we want to make a decision by looking into the future, which I can tell you when I next visit you, as I will then also tell you the report of the conversation by my father Svath concerning the primordial human earthly life forms.
Good. Then my question regarding the Phantom Airship Wave 1896 to 1897, after which I asked you to clarify what it was about.
There is not much to say about this, but only a little. Namely, that these were demonstrative maneuvers of Earth foreigners who have been working on Earth since time immemorial, and whose present descendants are also still here today and can be observed again and again all over the world. But our ancestors had nothing to do with these Earth foreigners, just as we Playaran also have nothing binding to do with them today and maintain no contact with them. Just as our ancestors did not make themselves known to them, we act in the same way and also shield ourselves completely from their entire systems of surveillance technology. For our part, with the help of the sonar, we have recently fathomed their technology and many of the possibilities, etc., that arise from it, and have come to the realization that these Earth-foreign entities are in fact still the same in their mentality and in their ways of acting and behaving, etc., as they were recognized by our early ancestors as dangerous to us Playaran. Dangerous precisely in the sense that this danger also exists for us through Earth humans, that we would lapse into the old forms, such as were still peculiar to our ancestors more than 52,000 years ago. Our years are approximately identical with earthly years, with regard to extremely evil degenerations in mentality, action, and behavior. Even after 52,000 years, we are still in danger of relapsing into the old degenerate forms, as a result of which we can fall from the good and positive to the evil and negative in every respect. And in this connection, it must be explained that this backsliding is given in the human life form, as you yourself know and also teach, as long as it still possesses a physical or material body. And if...
Excuse me if I interrupt you, because I want to explain that the fact of your words does not only apply to human life forms, but effectively to all life forms that have a physical existence, that is to say, have a tangible physical material body. Therefore, ontologically seen or from the point of view of the entire being, with regard to material constitutions of all life forms, there is none that could not fall back into old negative evil or positive good norms. However, this backsliding must be understood in such a way that it refers to the inner character impulses that exist in a negatively degenerated form and have not yet been overcome, worked through, or neutralized. And this is fundamentally the case with all life forms, because all living beings, as a result of their natural behavior with regard to their will to live and their will to self-preservation, developed from the ground-up combative forms or impulses, urges, and drives. It is these that, depending on the life form, became fixed in the innermost character block or instinct block ages ago, and became a fixed component, but which likewise, depending on the life form, develop specifically. In this way, the evolution of all lower instinct-driven and independently moving life forms resulted in their specific types of all their behaviors with regard to their food procurement, instinctuality, mating rituals and reproduction, and so on. This is in contrast to the evolutionary biological development of natural morphological or external form, construction, shape, as well as anatomical or internal structure of the organism, as well as the biochemical and physiological processes or life processes in the cells, tissues, and organs, whereby they also developed ethological characteristics or behavior, as this is fundamentally and ultimately universal for all life forms of every genus and species. In the case of higher life forms, which are capable of a conscious higher development of consciousness, this does not regulate itself, but fundamentally only through an independent, conscious mental learning function appropriate to understanding, reason, and intelligence. Only through this is it possible for the life form, and in this respect I am speaking of the human being, to tame, transform, dissolve and neutralize the impulses fixed in its innermost character, which it has created and fixed in itself in a degenerate way as evil and violence, etc., also itself in a conscious way. This, however, is a very long process, and even after death affects all new personalities again and again. For each new personality is only able to process and neutralize an extremely small part of its degenerations, which are glowing in the innermost character, during the entire lifetime of its material body. The whole process of complete dissolution up to the time when the human being is no longer born as a new personality with a physical or material body lasts until only the evolutionized and all-embracing spirit form remains, and no more material body can be born. And the fact that this process of dissolving all the degenerations fixed in the innermost character takes such an infinitely long time in order to process, dissolve, and neutralize them is due to the fact that these impulses of inner degenerations break through again and again in all life forms. So also in the human being, in every new life with every personality, consequently they are also lived outwardly. In this way, however, the degenerations that are lived out externally are perceived and also absorbed by fellow human beings and thus infiltrate them, whereby they are caught up again by their old negative, evil, and violent ways, and become addicted to them again or relapse. And this is exactly the reason why you play Aaron. By keeping your directives, are prevented from getting involved with other life forms through which you could fall back into the old destructive behavior, forms of action, and into the old catastrophic mentality. If you were to get into the area and influence of unmastered degenerations, such as these prevail precisely with the earthlings and the earth foreigners. The whole of what I have explained means, in other words, that a life form, and it does not matter whether it is a human being, a human-like or humanoid being, a mammal, animal, or any other living being, is always in danger of relapsing into old forms of thought and feeling, mentality, action, impulse, and behavior. With regard to the danger of backsliding or relapsing into old norms, it makes absolutely no difference how learned, studied, highly developed, advanced, knowledgeable, or even wise the life form is, because every life form is susceptible to external influences throughout its physical or bodily existence. And such influences are, after all, the thoughts and feelings, the mentality and the impulses, actions and behavior of all life forms, which bring all these factors to bear and live them out externally. And all these elements create on the one hand certain moments, occurrences, events, situations, and effects, and on the other hand, these are perceived by other life forms and influence them in a negative evil or positive good way. And depending on how the other or the observing, witnessing and experiencing life form receives the whole thing and processes and copes with it according to its intelligence, it logically reacts to it according to its intellect and reason. This, however, is only a spontaneous reaction, because already with the second occurrence of a similar or identical kind, a barely perceptible change takes place. This then proves to be more and more changing with the further repetition of the corresponding factor, namely in such a way that the perceived thing, a speech, a factor, a mentality, an action, deeds and behavior, etc., unconsciously creates impulses in the observer, which at first only very slowly and unnoticed become more and more similar to what is observed, witnessed, and experienced. So the whole thing that is observed, perceived, experienced, and witnessed by the observer slowly but surely rubs off on him or her, as a result of which he or she inevitably becomes of the same mind, action, and behavior over time, no matter what thoughts, feelings, impulses, mentality, way of acting and behavior he or she had before in a positive good or negative evil respect. Simply by observing, witnessing, and experiencing the perceptions, an indoctrination takes place, which leads to the fact that, if another opposite attitude, mentality, way of acting, and form of behavior existed before, the person will fall back into this. If, for example, a human being who is evil and violent changes for the better, becomes good, peaceful, loving, and nonviolent, and then lives in this way for years, but then over a longer period of time gets into a milieu in which evil and violence again prevail, then this rubs off on him again and he relapses, consequently falling back into his old thoughts, feelings, mentality, actions, and behavior. This is exactly the point that inevitably comes to the fore, no matter how long the time was during which the old way of life was lived. What is decisive is only the duration during which the new influence on the consciousness takes place, and the consciousness accepts everything, whereby it is formed anew.
Your explanation says everything, better than I probably would have. That is necessary. And with regard to our directives, these also actually ensure that we are spared from relapses into old behaviors, actions, deeds, and into a degenerated mentality. In accordance with our senses and aspirations and our directives, we cannot and must not enter into any contact with Earth humans and Earth foreigners, and also not make ourselves recognizable to them. But now the time has come again for us to end our conversation, because my duties call me again. So goodbye, Edward, my dear friend.
Yes, then also goodbye, Ta. Then, when I call up our conversation today, I will also attach the Wikipedia article that Michael V. showed me on the internet, in which you have photographed and read and also clarified the matter, as you just said. Goodbye and many thanks.
Phantom Airship Wave 1896 to 1897.
Phantom Airship, 1896. The Phantom Airship, Wave, 1896, 1897 English. Mystery Airship or Phantom Airship Wave was a series of sightings of an unidentified flying object that, according to contemporary newspaper reports, was seen by tens of thousands of human beings in at least 19 states of the United States between November 1896 and May 1897. Various natural as well as supernatural causes were cited for the observations, without any of these explanations being able to explain the totality of the sightings. Based on the descriptions handed down, however, the observations of real contemporary airships as well as extraterrestrial flying objects have been largely ruled out. For the human scientific analysis of possible causes, the phenomenon has been investigated in the last decades under mass psychological, sociological, and cultural historical questions. In the current reception, cultural scientific explanations are in the foreground.
Phantom Airship 1896. Crowd watching the airship Sacramento 1896.
First wave of sightings in 1896. The first reports of an unidentified flying object occurred on the stormy night of the 17th of November, 1896 in Sacramento and over Oakland. California, after strange lights in the sky, had already been observed sporadically since late September. Dozens of residents saw strong, shining lights in the rainy night sky. Some thought they saw a cigar-shaped shadow behind them. A tram driver named Lowry even stated that he could make out two men propelling the device via pedals. In the following weeks, more sightings were reported from all over California, as well as from Washington State and Canada to the north. Within a few days, a veritable blimp fever broke out. Human beings stood in the streets at night searching the skies for the luminous object. The highlight was the night of the 22nd of November, when sightings of an unidentified flying objects were reported from 11 locations between Chico and Pasadena.
Phantom Airship over Sacramento Illustration 1896.
The observations were reported controversially. The local newspapers, the Sacramento Bee and San Francisco Call, heated up the mood, while other newspapers, some of them well-known, treated the event disparagingly and with sarcastic undertones. But as the number of sightings increased, so did the number of critical voices. The San Francisco Chronicle quoted the well-known astronomer George Davidson, 1825 of 1911, who declared that in his opinion it was a combination of fraud and imagination. And the Portland newspaper Evening Telegram noted skeptically, "No one here will believe in the existence of this amazing airship until he or she sees it in full operation, of course." In December 1896, sighting reports diminished, and by Christmas, they ended altogether. Second wave of sightings in 1897. From February 1897 onwards, there was a rapid increase in the number of new sightings, mainly in the American Midwest and some southern states, which significantly exceeded the 1896 observations in terms of volume and reached their peak on the 17th of April with 14 sightings in one day. Although no more than one flying object had ever been seen at the same time, the media public now came to the conclusion that a single airship could not be responsible for all the sightings.
McCann sighting over Chicago illustration, April 1897.
In April 1897, the unknown airship was sighted several times over Chicago. On the 12th of April, the Chicago Times-Herald reported that news agent Walter McCann had taken 2 photographs of the Phantom airship flying over the city at an altitude of about 200 meters in the presence of witnesses in the city's Rogers Park on the morning of the previous day. Since most newspapers could not yet print photos due to the state of printing technology at the time, only a drawing of the flying objects appeared. The original photographs by McCann are considered lost. The newspapers also published numerous reports on landings and crashes of the object, as well as on contacts with the crew. In March 1897, a farmer near Sioux City, Iowa, described being caught and dragged by an anchor hanging from the unidentified flying objects. And in April 1897, the first abduction by the mysterious airships allegedly occurred. In Kansas, a 2-year-old cow was stolen from farmer Alexander Hamilton in Woodson County. In April, the airship hysteria reached its peak with several hundred sightings. Thousands of human beings searched the skies every evening in warm spring weather. After that, sightings declined abruptly and finally ended in the summer of 1897. 1909, 1913. There were a number of sightings of airships in 1909 in New England, New Zealand, and various places in Europe. Later sightings came from the UK in 1912 and 1913, by which time airship technology was well developed, leading to the assumption that these were private airships that had been sighted. Description of the flying objects and crews. As far as the descriptions were not limited to moving lights, the Phantom airships were predominantly described as elongated dark objects, sometimes with wings that could also fly against the wind and were equipped with glaring headlights. Even if occasionally the object was described as having shot away like a bullet or as having abruptly changed altitude or course, the flying objects were usually reported to be moving slowly and could therefore be easily observed. Among the many hundreds of reports, only one describes the airship as a 12-meter-long hat-shaped object, which is very close to today's idea of a UFO. A typical description of the airship is found in the Chicago Chronicle from the 13th of April, 1897. The machine was plainly seen and was about 60 feet, 18 meters in length. The vibrations of the wings were also distinct. It was studded with colored lights as usual, and the engine and a kind of music as of an orchestra were heard. And a witness named James Hooton of Arkansas, described as a well-known railway conductor, provided the following description of a landed flying object and its takeoff on the 20th of April, 1897. A closer examination showed that the keel was divided into 2 sections. In front, it flared out like the scabbard of a knife. The flanks were flared towards the middle to converge again at the back. On each side were 3 large wheels made of a flexible material that pressed in when they rolled. I noticed that in front of each wheel was a 2-inch tube from which air was now being blown onto the wheels. The wheels began to turn and the ship rose with a hissing sound. Suddenly, the plane made a leap, pointed its bow skywards, and the rudders at the end were swung to one side. The wheels were now spinning so fast that the spokes were barely visible. Faster than I can tell, the ship was gone.
A visitor from Mars? 1897.
Reports also appeared of several landings involving contact with crew members of the Phantom airships. These were almost invariably described as ordinary human beings. Sometimes it was a woman, sometimes a medium-sized man with tinted glasses, a man with a long dark beard, or a small man with a light blue sailor suit. When spoken to, they always answered in English. The few surviving accounts of giants, alien, or non-human flight occupants are, in Senap's opinion, false statements. Social framework conditions. The 1890s were a time of great social upheaval, tension, and problems for the United States. With the end of the Indian Wars, the opening up of the West had come to an end in 1890, and the continent was settled. The meaningful frontier experience of the Americans was now directed outwards from the interior of their own country, especially against the colonial power Spain, and according to the cultural historian Gregory M. Fitzer, upwards into the sky. The airships appeared in the middle of a crisis caused by Spain and Cuba, where insurgents were fighting for independence. The majority of the U.S. population sympathized with the rebels, and in 1898, the U.S. finally intervened in the Spanish-American War. The mysterious airships were associated several times with the Cubans' War of Liberation. In January 1897, for example, former California Attorney General William H. Hart, 1848 to 1903, declared that the alleged inventor of the airship was on his way to Cuba to support the insurgents in their fight. As with the UFO wave of the 1940s and 1950s, the American population was simultaneously confronted with economic and political developments that triggered existential fears in large sections of the population. Between 1893 and 1897, the country went through the third economic depression since the end of the War of Secession in 1865. Industrialization since the end of the Civil War had led to the formation of large economic trusts that influenced politics and triggered violent reactions among the population, which was suffering from high unemployment due to their price policies aimed at maximizing profits. Parallel to this, the first large trade unions emerged, and there were sometimes violent economic political disputes. Pullman Strike, 1894. The presidential election in November 1896, with the extremely narrow victory of William McKinley against the little man's candidate, William Jennings Bryan, intensified these tensions. Human beings lived in an age of leaps and bounds in scientific and technological development, which attracted positive public interest. Everything seemed possible. The public had also been sensitized to the current development of aviation, since Senator Henry Cabot Lodge had introduced a bill that provided for a prize of USD 100,000 for the development of a dirigible airship by 1901. The majority of Americans were firmly convinced that it was only a matter of time before the problem of air travel would also be solved. Sources. The only sources available for the phantom airship phenomenon are largely contemporary newspaper reports. The truth content is mostly very questionable. Furthermore, many of these reports are based only on hearsay, as already the front-page report of the newspaper Daily Republic from Rockford, Illinois, on the 12th of April 1897 notes, railroad men who pass through there say that the telegraph operator says that some cattle dealers say that some farmers say that the ship had a technical malfunction and had to land for repairs. Although it is known from folklore and everyday life research that extraordinary super-individual events are also always reflected in the private records of human beings, almost no airship references have survived from contemporary letters and diaries. The folklorist Thomas E. Bullard also points out that there were hardly any reports about the mysterious flying objects in the regional sections of the newspapers, which were specifically intended for the local population. In 1967, UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek called on still-living witnesses of the events to come forward during a national radio broadcast to New York, but without success. The main problem, however, is that there are no remains or traces of the objects described, although crashes of the airship have been reported several times and wreckage has allegedly been collected and described. Explanations from the beginning. There were numerous competing interpretations of the 1896-97 observations, which essentially anticipated the explanatory models discussed in modern ufology. The majority of contemporary observers and authors interpreted the airships as technically innovative terrestrial flying objects. In contrast to the UFO discussion of the 20th century, however, conspiracy theories and the question of secret government involvement in the events did not play a significant role. This majority was opposed by a strong contemporary group that considered the published reports to be frauds and fakes by the alleged witnesses or the press. Another group, which usually referred to recognized scientists, classified the events as a misinterpretation of natural phenomena. In addition, mass psychological phenomena among the population were already described in contemporary publications. Furthermore, occasional reference was made to the connection of the observations with religious ideas, as well as themes in entertainment and popular science literature. The theory of extraterrestrial visitors did not play a serious role in the discussion at the time. Moreover, the few reports dealing with this explanation proved to be false, as far as they could be verified. However, none of the explanations can be applied to the totality or the majority of the sightings. In detail, real existing airship constructions. Numerous witnesses and contemporaries of the sightings at that time assumed that they had seen a real steerable airship on a test flight. This theory is rejected by the majority of today's authors, who point out that the state of aviation technology at the time did not correspond to the characteristics of the phantom airships described.
Aerial torpedo balloon, 1896.
It is true that work was being done worldwide on the development of steerable flying objects, and there were also initial positive results. For example, La France flew a controlled circuit near Paris several times in 1,884 85ths, and Count Zeppelin worked on his first airship plans at Lake Constance from 1890. In America, Solomon Andrews, 1806-1872, flew his so-called Arion against the wind in the mid-1860s, and from 1867, Frederick Marriott C. 1805, 1884 constructed a cigar-shaped and winged airship model called Aviator Hermes Jr. in San Francisco, which first flew in 1869. Even in the weeks leading up to the first sightings, newspapers reported several times on current developments in airship technology. In September 1896, the Sunday Herald Baltimore carried a long article about a military torpedo balloon, illustrated with a drawing of the device. But none of these devices had the characteristics shown by the Phantom airship and were capable of covering the roads traveled in the late 1890s. This rules out a known terrestrial airship existing at the time to explain the massive sightings. Furthermore, from the beginning of the sightings in November 1896, numerous persons declared that they were the inventors of the mysterious airship, but in no case could this claim be substantiated. The renowned inventor Thomas Alva Edison declared that it was inconceivable that anyone could construct a successful airship and keep this fact a secret. The most absurd claim came from a man from the Californian town of Arbuckle, who claimed that it was an airship he had constructed, but that it had been stolen from him by two tramps in March 1896. Several modern authors nevertheless tried to prove that there had been innovative real airships in the late 1890s that were ahead of the development of their time. They justify their sudden disappearance with an accidental disaster or economic political conspiracy theories. However, all these attempts at explanation lack plausibility and, above all, evidence. Fraud and false reports. A number of airship sightings were based on children and other jokers launching hot air balloons or kites to amuse or confuse their fellow citizens. In San Francisco's Mission District, on the other hand, a vigilante group was formed in 1896. Several alleged airship inventors and tradesmen also used the airship hype for self-promotion. In 1897, for example, the Ringling Brothers Circus regularly launched a balloon for advertising purposes, which caused a great public stir each time. Newspaper coverage. From the beginning, the airship hysteria was primarily a newspaper phenomenon. In the 19th century, daily newspapers satisfied the purely tabloid entertainment needs of the population far more than they do today. In the process, little consideration was given to the seriousness of the reports, and the border to fiction was often crossed. A careful assessment of the published reports on the phantom airships shows that apparently a large part of the false reports originated directly in the newspaper editorial offices. It is also striking that only a few newspapers published the majority of the airship reports. In California, it was the San Francisco Call. In Nebraska, the Omaha Bee. In Illinois and Indiana, the Times-Herald from Chicago. In Kansas, the Champion from Atchison. And in Texas, the Dallas Morning News. From this, the author James L. Cambias theorized that it was not the road of an airship, but the appearance of newspaper articles in nearby towns that was the cause of new sightings. And the Baltimore Sun ironically raised the question in April 1897 whether the phantom airship was not a flying sea serpent, which, like the Loch Ness Monster later, was a common pickle-time topic of the press at the time.
Newspaper headline 1896.
Journalists who invented airship reports had a prominent role model. For as early as 1844, Edgar Allan Poe had published a false report in the New York Sun about a transatlantic crossing by balloon. There were numerous reports that were recognizable as nonsense at first glance. One newspaper reported that a man shouted from the airship, "Wyver 8 rough e Burke's bus," which read backwards was merely the advertising slogan, "Subscribe to the Review." Another report said that through a window in the airship, a bound woman could be seen being threatened by a man with a revolver. In addition, alleged letters from the airship crew appeared in various places, one of which was addressed to Thomas Edison. For Edison, however, the whole thing was nothing but a hoax. Several newspaper reports that have been debunked as fabrications are still reported in ufological literature today, including some of the following examples. Lodi, the 25th of November, 1896. On the 27th of November, 1896, the Stockton Evening Mail published under the title 3. Strange Visitors, the report of a Colonel H.G. Shaw who claims to have encountered 3 non-human beings from an airship near the village of about 50 kilometers from Sacramento, who he believes were Martians.
Alleged witness H.G. Shaw drawing 1895.
They were taller than 2 meters and very slender. I further noticed that their hands were quite small and delicate, and that their fingers had no nails. Their feet, however, were almost twice as long as those of ordinary human beings. When one of them came close to me, I touched him by placing my hand under his elbow and gently pressing it upwards. And who would have thought it? I lifted him off the ground with almost no effort. I would estimate that the specific weight of the being was less than an ounce. They were without any kind of clothing, but covered with a natural growth that was difficult to describe. It was neither hair nor like feathers, but when touched it was as soft as silk, and their skin was like velvet. Their faces and heads were hairless, their ears very small, and the nose had the appearance of polished ivory, while the eyes were large and shining. The mouth, however, was small and, as it seemed to me, without teeth. The Colonel Shaw presented in the article as the organizer of a trade exhibition was the English-born veteran of the American Civil War, Henry Glenville Shaw, 1843-1907, a veteran go-getting journalist with frequently changing employers who only a few weeks before the publication of the report was editor-in-chief of the Stockton Evening Mail of all things. At the time of the alleged encounter, he was in the process of giving some impetus to the business life of the young community of Stockton. Shaw's report was considered so implausible by his journalistic colleagues that not even the San Francisco Call, which otherwise published even the smallest news item about the alleged airships, reported on it, even though Shaw had previously worked for the Call himself, and several detailed articles about Shaw's other activities appeared in the newspaper at the time. The question therefore also remained unanswered as to why Shaw, known as a gun enthusiast, did not simply shoot the unknown creatures as evidence. Aurora, the 16th of April, 1897. The best-known single event of the Phantom airship wave is the so-called Aurora UFO incident. According to a newspaper correspondent's report, an unidentified airship flew over Market Square, collided with Judge Proctor's windmill as it reached the northern part of town, and went to pieces with a terrible explosion, scattering debris over several acres. The ship was made of an unknown material that resembled a mixture of aluminum and silver. Many human beings collected samples of the strange metal from the wreckage, he said. The pilot of the ship was not an inhabitant of this world and had left records in unknown hieroglyphics. Later, the aliens' remains were buried in the town's cemetery. The case is considered an invention of the journalist He Hayden, who wanted to draw attention to the economically hard-pressed town. Nevertheless, there are still individual proponents of the UFO thesis today. But also more recent investigations by ufologists have not been able to provide any viable evidence of a real accident. Waterloo, the 16th of April, 1897. On the night of the 16th of April, an airship allegedly had to make an emergency landing in the small town of Waterloo, Iowa. The armed airshipman told the police that he was Professor Jurgensen from San Francisco and was currently on a world tour with his machine. His partner, Professor Stormont, had fallen out of the balloon shortly before landing. He offered a reward of $500 for the discovery of his remains. The device consisted of two bulging buoyancy bodies, a canvas-covered cockpit, a large lantern, and a propeller mounted at the rear. The steam engine used for propulsion was reportedly undergoing repairs. Countless visitors flocked to the city to see the flying object, which had to be protected by the police. Nevertheless, the device caught fire the next night and was destroyed.
Waterloo airship imitation, 1897.
Schnellstellte sich heraus, dass das fiktive Luftschiff auf eine Idee von drei Männern aus dem nahegelegenen Nashua zurückging, von denen einer der Herausgeber einer kleinen Regionalzeitung war. Beteiligt waren in dem Fache auch ein Reporter und einer der Polizisten aus Aurora. Ein zeitgenössisches Foto belegt, dass das beschriebene gasgefüllte Gerät aufgrund seiner Größe und Konstruktion physikalisch kaum in der Lage gewesen war, sein Eigengewicht in die Luft zu heben, geschweige denn mehrere Passagiere. Further cases, April 1897. On the 14th of April, 1897, the Courier-Herald in Saginaw, Michigan, reported the landing of an airship from which an almost 3-meter tall, almost naked giant had risen. As numerous human beings from the nearby towns of Morley and Howard City converged, the giant severely injured one human being. Hundreds of human beings watched the takeoff afterwards. It is not known whether the giant was keen to repeat the action or whether a provincial editor was having a joke. But an almost identical article appeared a few days later in the Lansing State Republican. Only this time, the incident took place in the village of Williamston. In mid-April, the Chicago Record reported the crash of a phantom airship in Champaign County, Illinois. The surviving crew members had fled, killing a young farmer. 3 mutilated bodies, which looked like Japanese, remained in the wreckage. The local Champaign Daily Gazette checked the story, but found no evidence of correctness. A particularly fanciful story was published by the Dallas Morning News in April 1897, according to which the crew of an airship that landed in Ellis County, Texas, claimed that they came from the North Pole, were part of a fleet of 20 airships that traveled the Americas and Europe, and had learned English in 1553 from Hugh Willoughby's North Pole expedition. The report proved to be a publicity stunt for the Tennessee Centennial Exposition in Nashville, where the ships would supposedly appear. In late April 1897, reports appeared in numerous Texas newspapers about the landing of a secret airship prototype in Uvalde, where one of the inventors named Wilson was said to have inquired of the local sheriff, Henry Baylor, about a fellow sheriff named Akers, who was by then working elsewhere. Promptly, a statement by Akers appeared shortly afterwards, confirming his acquaintance with Wilson. And just as promptly, a denial from Sheriff Baylor followed, in which he called the story a Munchausen's tale. Furthermore, Baylor absurdly stated that the editor responsible for the hoax had been shot on orders. All 3 allegations were fictitious. Perceptual illusions. One explanatory model for extraordinary or paranormal experiences and sightings defines them as the result of misinterpreted cognitive processes. That is to say, as psychological illusions similar to optical illusions, whereby perceptions can be induced or real experiences distorted. In particular, misinterpreted natural phenomena come into question. The sky did indeed show some astronomical peculiarities in November 1896, and in the first months of 1897, from the night of the 13th of November onwards. As every year, a fast-flying meteor stream, the so-called Leonids, appeared with green and blue coloring, peaking at the same time as the first airship sightings. Even then, the New York Times suspected that some of the reported observations were actually meteors. In the winter of 1896-97, the planets Venus and Mars could be seen clearly enlarged in the sky. From February 1897, Venus was also visible at midday, reaching its maximum size on the 23rd of March, 1897, exactly at the beginning of the second wave of sightings. Already in publications of that time, it was pointed out that some of the eyewitnesses could in reality confuse the planets with an airship of the Leonid meteor shower of 1833, especially since in the dark night sky, drifting clouds can give the impression of a moving luminous object. And indeed, such confusions are described in contemporary newspaper articles. Furthermore, contemporary astronomers refer to the Betelgeuse,
Leonid meteor shower of 1833.
Zoological phenomena were also invoked for the sightings. The science fiction author James Cambias, for example, speculated that the perceived flapping sounds were caused by migratory birds. One possible cause for these perceptual disturbances was suspected to be excessive alcohol consumption during the entire period of the sightings. The San Francisco Chronicle of the 20th of November, 1896 criticized the fact that the witnesses, whom the paper called illuminated staggers, were mainly bartenders and tavern patrons. Subsequently, many newspapers explicitly emphasized in their reports that their witnesses would not consume hard alcoholic drinks. Mass psychological processes. Another explanatory model for sightings by large numbers of human beings is mass psychological processes such as mass hysteria and mass suggestion. In particular, during the airship wave of 1897, thousands of human beings in several American states purposefully scanned the horizon evening after evening to detect signs of an airship. The whole thing became, according to newspaper reports, a kind of general pastime, sometimes in the form of parties. Eventually, according to sociologist Robert Bartholomew, they saw or thought they saw exactly what they expected to see. It happened in Texas, for example, that the inhabitants of a small town on the railway line to Dallas mistook a passing special train for the airship. On one occasion, the airship turned out to be a sheet of wrapping paper whirled up by the wind. According to newspaper reports, even Indians on the Pima Reservation in Arizona began building a giant airship model after a day-long powwow. Bartholomew retrospectively defines the phantom airship craze as social self-deception and points to the scientifically proven unreliability of eyewitness accounts. For him, the numerous reports are merely a symbolic projection of the prevailing technological mania and the seemingly boundless faith in science. The mass hysteria theory was criticized for not offering a sufficient explanation for the rapid spread of sightings in November 1896. Furthermore, it could also not offer a conclusive explanation for the regional wandering of the alleged observations. Classification in cultural studies. According to a theory that is also accepted by some ufologists, the reports are to be classified in the context of cultural historical processes and understood as collective narration. According to this theory, the descriptions are based on cultural adoptions. That is to say, the experiences are based on mythological and religious ideas, fairy tales, stories, and books. Media studies findings on the dissemination and introception of social patterns of interpretation support this theory. In narrative research, a subfield of folklore studies, the airship wave of 1,896/97 is compared with classical sagas and used as an example of a so-called modern legend.
Phantom airship over Sacramento illustration 1896.
Throughout the 19th century, numerous books and stories were published worldwide that can be classified as science fiction literature and deal with the conquest of airspace. Among the most popular books is the novel Rober the Conqueror by Jules Verne, first published in 1886, which was also followed by numerous imitators in America, such as the author Robert Duncan Milne, who mainly published in newspapers like the San Francisco Call. This was reinforced by scientific discoveries, such as that of the alleged Martian canals in 1877, which led to wild speculation about extraterrestrial life. From the 1880s onwards, encounters with extraterrestrials also increasingly appeared in the fictional literary genre. According to many scholars, the few descriptions of the airship crew as extraterrestrials that seem like modern alien accounts are based on these models, the majority of which, moreover, subsequently proved to be newspaper hoaxes. In the evaluation of the phantom airship observations, 3 newspaper publications are particularly conspicuous, in which a takeover cannot be ruled out due to the close content and temporal connection with the sightings. As early as January 1887, the popular science magazine Scientific American published an illustrated article on a motorized airship invention by a certain Moses S. Cole. What is most striking is that the flying apparatus depicted, which was never realized, largely corresponds to the drawings of the Sacramento sighting.
Cole's aerial vessel, 1886.
The San Francisco Call published an illustrated article in early September 1896 about a cylindrical flying object with flapping wings hanging from a balloon and a wagon-like cabin attached underneath. These features also appear repeatedly in the descriptions and drawings of the Phantom airship. On the 17th and the 18th of November 1896, numerous newspapers published news of an airship inventor who announced his intention to fly across the American continent in just 2 days. Only a few hours after the first announcement appeared in the newspaper Sacramento Bee, the first sightings occurred. The interpretation of the unknown flying objects also took on religious overtones. At the height of the second wave of sightings, newspapers spoke of the airships as signs from heaven. There were voices claiming that they heralded the return of Christ or the end of the world. One priest declared that the object was the flying biblical tabernacle. And a self-proclaimed prophet in Kearney proclaimed that the heavenly visitors would one day descend from the clouds and destroy the city like Sodom and Gomorrah. Another theory, albeit unsubstantiated, is that railway and telegraph workers were responsible for the dissemination of some of the airship messages, passing the time over the communications network at their disposal in the manner of modern internet junkies, inventing a modern myth in the process. Ufological interpretations. Most ufologists also believe that the phantom airships of the 1890s were not the vehicles of extraterrestrials, but a product of media reporting. The representative of the extraterrestrial theory, on the other hand, is George Hunt Williamson, 1926 to 1986, one of the so-called UFO contactors of the 1950s. For him, the phantom airship wave is part of a great cosmic program of visitors from outer space to spread a universal truth. And authors Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman sought to prove that behind the airships was a secret society of inventors who drew their technical knowledge from non-human beings. An increasingly growing group of ufologists advocates the thesis of cultural takeovers. According to UFO researcher Jacques Vallée, the sightings thus close the gap between the apparitions of antiquity and modern stories about flying saucers. Against the interpretation of the mysterious airships as extraterrestrial UFOs, in today's sense, speak the consistent descriptions of wings, propellers, rudders, anchors, and bolt riveting, which would be of little use for a spaceship. Rejoinders from the ufological side that UFOs would adapt to the respective social ideas of the observers remain speculative. Statistical evaluation of sightings. The focus of sighting reports began in California in 1896, moved to the Midwest in 1897, especially Indiana, Illinois and Michigan, then turned south to the states of Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, and ended in Louisiana and Texas. The extent of the sightings in 1,896/97 can only be recorded on the basis of contemporary journalistic reporting, which is said to comprise about 1,500 articles. There are lists in the literature and in ufological compilations that list several hundred sightings. However, these are not consistently supported by sources. Furthermore, multiple observations of the same object are listed as single sightings in them, even if the reports are related in time and come from locations close to each other. Furthermore, some of the sightings turned out to be fakes. As early as the 1970s, Robert G. Neely investigated the airship wave in Illinois and analyzed 207 newspaper reports. Of these, 184 merely described lights in the sky, although in 10 cases, these were already identified as celestial bodies in the article. In 25 cases, the reports were lies. Based on the contemporary sources, an approximate value of about 700 sighting reports results. If the unadjusted reports from the two largest newspaper databases are grouped on a timeline, the two waves of sightings from November 1896 and the end of March 1897 can be clearly identified. A subdivision of the reports into sightings of 1. Lights in the sky where no solid body was seen, and 2. Described aircraft shows that about 42% of the reports describe only vague optical anomaly sea table.